Chapter 7. God's Timetable. God isn't finished with Israel, although there have been many times in our long history where a casual glance might have led someone to that conclusion. During one of those times, a bright young man of noble lineage named Daniel had been carried off to Babylon from his home in Jerusalem, never to return. Daniel's faith and courage during his long and illustrious career as a high-ranking civil servant, one of the wise men of Babylon, singled him out as a man God could trust to receive the most sweeping prophecies in the entire Hebrew Bible. What Yahweh told him would prove to be the key to the chronology of God, his timetable for the whole human race. In 538 B.C., 67 years after he had been hauled off as a prize of war, Daniel realized that the prophet Jeremiah had predicted, in Jeremiah 25:11, that Judah would serve the king of Babylon for only 75 years. The time of her punishment was nearly over. Naturally, being a man of God and a wise man to boot, Daniel began to pray that God would fulfill his promise. Now, there's a lesson in there for us, by the way. If you want your prayer answered, pray for what you know God wants. God has every intention of keeping his word, but he gave Daniel a bit more than he bargained for. We pick up the story in the 9th chapter.
Now while I was speaking, praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before Yahweh my God for the holy mountain of my God, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. And he informed me, and talked with me, and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplications the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore consider the matter, and understand the vision. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Daniel 9:20-24.
Gabriel had just turned on the information fire hose. If we're going to drink it in, we'll need to slow it down to a trickle. First, what does 70 weeks mean? A week is literally a 7. It could be 7 days or 7 years. The context is the key, and the context here clearly indicates that a 7-year week is meant. 70 weeks of days is only 16 months, not nearly enough time for the fulfillment of the whole prophecy. And elsewhere, when Daniel means a week of 7 days, he spells it out, as in chapter 10, verse 2, 3 weeks of days. 70 weeks is therefore 70 7-year periods, or 490 years. A year, by the way, would have been reckoned by Daniel to be an even 360 days, 12 months each of 30 days, not the 365.24219879 days we know and love. The Babylonians and their guests actually observed 2 calendars, a complicated lunar-based model which added 7 intercalary months every 19 years to adjust for the shifting seasons, and this 360-day schematic version, which compensated by adding 5 days at the end. Now, don't think of them as naive and backward for this practice. They were quite aware that the real year was about 365.25 days long. But these calendars made far more practical sense in the days before sophisticated mathematics, precise methods of measuring the sun's path, and robust means of communicating what had been observed. With a lunar system, everyone had a reliable way to periodically set their clocks. Since a lunar cycle took 29.53 days to complete, every new moon marked a new month. But in practice, the 360-day civil calendar was easier to use and communicate.
Your people
Meant Israel, and
your holy city
meant Jerusalem. Although Daniel spent his entire adult life in Babylonian society, he never lost sight of who he was, one of God's chosen. He personified the pilgrim mentality that Yahweh wanted in his people. The sledding gets heavier with the phrase,
finish the transgression.
the breaking of God's law was why Israel had been removed from the land of promise in the first place. It was the reason Daniel was here on his knees, begging for God's mercy and restoration. Was Gabe telling him that there would someday be no more such transgression? That the apostasy of his people would have seen its last day? It must have seemed too good to be true.
To make an end of sins.
Went even farther. Who could imagine a world, even a nation, without sin? The Levitical sacrifices had been instituted to temporarily cover over the sins of the people, but this would require something more substantial, something permanent, something universal. Besides, the temple had been destroyed almost 50 years ago now. Israel couldn't have made sacrifices to atone for their sins if they wanted to. No, this would have to be something bigger than all that. This would have to be Yahweh's doing.
To make reconciliation for iniquity.
By this time, Daniel's head must have been swimming. This was the one thing most desired by fallen man, or at least it should have been. Reconciliation with God, erasing the curse that had come upon us because of our sin. Perhaps Daniel thought back to Yahweh's promise to Abraham, "In you shall all the families of the earth be blessed." How could this be? What would God do? Whatever it was, it would happen within this 490-year period.
To bring in everlasting righteousness.
Yes, that would follow our reconciliation, wouldn't it? Daniel's heart must have leapt at the word everlasting. It meant that once God had achieved his purpose, we would never again fall into sin. That implied we would be fundamentally different than we are now. No more these frail mortal creatures who can't seem to make it through the day without grieving our Maker, but sinless, immortal beings, walking in complete harmony with God and man. If there's a Chaldean word for wow, he must have said it.
To seal up vision and prophecy.
Okay, he must have thought, at least this is familiar ground. Daniel had been receiving visions and interpreting prophetic dreams ever since he was a young man. Gabriel was telling him that everything he had foreseen would come to fruition. For that matter, everything that had been seen by all of God's prophets would come to pass. All the dreams and visions, all of the one-on-one revelations, the types, the metaphors, the dress rehearsals, they would all be fulfilled when these last 490 years of Israel's future history were finished.
And to anoint the set apart, in the literal sense of the words, and to anoint the most holy, as it is translated.
This anointed one, or Messiah, would be the great king who had been prophesied to reign forever from the throne of David. Daniel would have been quite familiar with his people's expectations of this man, for his lineage and his character had been prophesied. The time of his coming, however, had not. Gabriel's message continues.
Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem, until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. Daniel 9:25.
The word for prince, the Hebrew Nagayad, stresses the aspect of command, whether civil, military, or religious. The root of this word, nagad, means to stand boldly out opposite, to manifest, to expose, predict, explain, or praise. It is not a stretch, then, to describe Messiah the Prince as a bold commander and prophet, anointed by Yahweh to be the manifestation of his power. Daniel 9:25 is a passage that drives the skeptics nuts. It pinpoints the starting date of the 70 weeks period and specifies the length of time that is to pass before Messiah, the Prince, is to appear. As we'll see in a moment, the prediction is so precise and verifiable, it requires a miraculous knowledge of future events. Critics of the book of Daniel have tried for years to establish a date of its writing, hundreds of years after his death. Its plethora of specific and detailed prophecies about the times of the Gentiles, prophecies that were fulfilled to the letter, prove that Yahweh's knowledge transcends time, and or that his ability and willingness to manipulate world events transcends the power of mortal man. That makes their unbelief look foolish, which it is. So they usually suggest a date after the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, who reigned from 175 to 163 BC. But the Talmud supports authorship of the historical 6th century Daniel, and unfortunately for them, there's the little matter of the Septuagint. The Old Covenant scriptures were translated into Greek in Alexandria around 275 BC. It's hard to translate something that hasn't been written yet. Also, late 2nd century BC fragments of Daniel have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. For instance, Q4 Dan, C4 Q114, making 2nd century authorship highly unlikely. But even if the book had been written in the 2nd century BC, it wouldn't help the case of the anti-prophecy critics in the case of the passage at hand, Daniel 9. This prophecy's fulfillment occurred well into the 1st century AD. The chronology works out like this. The starting gun was a command to restore and build Jerusalem. This was not the edict of Cyrus, who had merely authorized the rebuilding of the temple, which was made in the same year as Daniel's vision, but rather the proclamation of Artaxerxes Longimanus, almost 100 years later.
And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I, and that would be Nehemiah, took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, Why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of the heart. So I became dreadfully afraid, and said to the king, May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad, when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies in waste, and its gates are burned with fire? Then the king said to me, What do you request? I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Then the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, How long will your journey be, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Nehemiah 2, 1-6.
Most scholars, including the esteemed Sir Robert Anderson, whom I believe was the first to calculate this, peg the 20th year of Artaxerxes at 445 BC. It's simple arithmetic. His father, Xerxes, a.k.a. Ahasuerus, the husband of Queen Esther, died in 465. Add 20 years to that, and you come to 445. But they failed to take into account the little drama that transpired following the death, the murder, of Xerxes. The king had been killed in his sleep by an ambitious fellow named Artabanus, the king's vizier or bodyguard, who, according to Aristotle, killed the heir apparent, Darius, as well.